Hi, I'm Jerry Sparks, President of AG Financial Insurance Solutions, and we have with us today Rich Hammer, attorney, CPA, best-selling author on church law and taxes, and a Harvard Law graduate. And thanks, Rich, for coming back with us.
Thanks, Jerry.
So we're here to talk about Risk Management Live, and first of all, we just want to say, for those people that are going through Hurricane Sandy, you're in our prayers, and if you have damage, we want you to be able to contact your insurance agent. If you can't get a hold of your insurance agent, call the company direct. They're going to have special claims crews handling these claims with this kind of disaster. I was listening last night to the TV, and they were saying that this could be the largest disaster as far as a hurricane in history because of the amount of people that are affected with it. If you need to secure your premises, go ahead and do so. Insurance coverage does cover that, just to keep your premises secure. So we wanted to let you know that, and you're in our prayers for that. Last month we talked about volunteers, and we're going to just do a little summary of what we talked about. You can go to the previous TV spot that we had and watch this if you want to, but we're going to do a little summary here. If you when you're picking volunteers, selecting and supervising your volunteers, you need to have a written application. In that written application, you need to ask certain questions. That application is online. You need to get references from people that know of their ability to work with children. Remember to use 2 adults at all times with the child, so no child is left alone with 1 adult. Supervision, you need to make sure that you're adequately supervising the children. Watch out for hazardous and avoid hazardous activities if at all possible. And now we're going to talk a little bit about vicarious liability and how that affects volunteers.
Yes, well, Jerry, vicarious liability simply means A is liable for something that B does. And how does that relate to volunteers? Our topic for our last session and today is that a church can be vicariously liable for the actions of volunteers, just as it can for its employees. It's the same rule. And the point is that any negligent act by a volunteer committed in the course of that person performing his or her responsibilities on behalf of the church can be imputed to the church. And so the church can be liable even though it had nothing to do with it directly, and maybe, in fact, discouraged or prohibited the type of behavior that was engaged in. Let me give you an example. Let's say that a church has a policy, which I recommend, a cell phone policy, that no cell phones can be utilized, certainly not for text messaging or for calls, while driving a vehicle on church business of any kind. And so so that's a policy that prohibits that type of behavior. If a volunteer disregards that policy, then the church obviously can be responsible, even though it prohibited the type of behavior that was engaged in that caused the injury. And so we see the same thing in other contexts as well, such as driving a vehicle just in general. This is a very frequent claim for churches, is that a volunteer or employee was driving a vehicle, maybe a church vehicle, maybe their own vehicle, on some church business and was negligent in driving, maybe went through a red light, maybe was speeding, caused an accident, injured or killed somebody. The church can be responsible for that if the volunteer was acting in the course of his or her duties on behalf of the church.
Yeah, actually, we have seen this happen way too many times, and it happens in all businesses, but churches aren't exempt in that. A lot of churches will have volunteers, whether they're transporting children or going to a field trip, if they're a school, where they have volunteers and they utilize volunteers versus hiring a bus, utilizing that vehicle. At AG Financial, we actually came up with a form to help protect the churches, and we'll make this available to everybody online. But what it does is it puts a lot of the risk management portion to protect the church and letting the church know that the people have minimum coverages, number one. Number two, their to-dos are, so that people know what they need to do and what is required of them. So let me just give you a little bit of
Yes.
what we came up with. It'll actually have the driver's name, and it'll say, specify their insurance coverage. They're going to maintain the appropriate levels, the minimum limits that we set. They'll provide a copy of the insurance policy to the church. They will actually give them a copy of their driver's license so they can run a background check and make sure that they do not have that they do have a driver's license and their driver's license is valid. If they're convicted of more than one minor traffic violation or have more than one at-fault accident, they got to notify them. And here's where it comes to vehicle safety. It says a number of passengers with working seat belts in this vehicle. So you know that you have a seat belt for every person that is in that vehicle. As required by law, I guarantee that all occupants will be wearing those seat belts. And while this vehicle is being operated, I will comply with the safety requirements of the vehicle, but not limited, of this vehicle, including but not limited to airbags. So if there's airbags, they will not make them inoperable. The operation or the automobile being driven for this specific event is in good working operation. So you know that the car can make it there and back, and you know you don't have problems with it. And I will caravan with this group, and we'll keep close contact with the church staff during this trip. So you don't have people going off on their own with 6 kids in the car, and you don't know what happened to them. So all of this basically puts the onus basically back on the volunteer and gives a little bit added protection back to the church.
Very good. Well, and then Jerry, you think I think some people have asked us this question, and that is, in fact, you and I both are working on a case right now in another state where there was a van rollover, and several children were injured. One was killed because the youth pastor fell asleep at the wheel of the van because he'd been in an all-night lock-in the night before with these kids. This is just one reason why I absolutely oppose lock-ins. Where do we see this in church history? That kids, adolescents, are warehoused, locked into a building, fed stimulating beverages and foods, stay up all night watching videos and playing games, and are zombies for the next week in school. Where in Scripture do we see this practice? I mean, I think it's abhorrent. And here, this youth pastor falls asleep, causes a horrific accident. And one of the issues in that case is whether there's any insurance coverage. And one of the issues that arose was the whole issue of who was named as an additional insured on the insurance policy. And that also swerves into the non-owned vehicle coverage. You might want to comment on those briefly.
Yeah, one of the things that we suggest every church covers is hired and non-owned automobile. And what actually happens a lot of times is if you have a person running an errand for the church, whether it's going to the bank, making the deposit, going to get the mail, or if they're doing an activity where we have them transporting children in their own vehicle, hired and non-owned liability will automatically give liability coverage to the church for that incident, even though the primary coverage will be under the person that is actually driving in their vehicle because insurance follows the specific car. It will give the church additional liability if there is an accident in anything. One of our largest cases was a hired and non-owned liability where a person was going to the post office, and when they went to the post office, they had an accident. Just happened to run into an attorney with a Mercedes. The wife was actually a neurosurgeon. So it was a very, very large claim, and the person had the state minimum limits. $10,000 property damage, and you run into a $60,000 vehicle, $25,000 bodily injury, just for the lady to be off work with a broken hand. Okay, that claim came in. It was settled for over $900,000 because she could not operate and do surgery for a while. So, hired and non-owned automobile coverage, you need to make sure that you do have that coverage on your policy.